Thank you, Senator Pratt. Senator Patrick.
Madam Acting Deputy President, I rise to speak on the Custom Amendments Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement Implementation Bill and the corresponding Customs Tariff Amendment Bill. It's interesting. I've been listening to the debate in the chamber, to listening to the comments of the Greens, One Nation, Labor, and of course the government. But interestingly, particularly on the Labor side, and I'll accuse One Nation of this as well, standing up pointing out all of the things that they believe in, yet this particular agreement presents risks for all of those things. So I hope there's an upside in trade without really examining the risks to the very principles that the Labor Party purport to support, and indeed One Nation purports to support. I always listen to Senator Roberts when he says we've got to base our considerations on data and facts, and I agree with that principle. But this is a situation where there's no evidence of an economic benefit that flows from entering into this agreement. There is no independent economic assessment of the cost and the benefits to RCEP. And there's no additional market access for Australian exporters. Don't we have a responsibility to look at a piece of legislation and say, what are the pros, what are the cons? Here we have no view as to the economic benefits. Part of the problem here, of course, is, as Senator Pratt mentioned, whenever these deals get negotiated, they get negotiated in secret. There's no opportunity to see the text of them, such that people can then do proper analysis and present the parliament with information such that it can make an informed decision. None of that's there. Time and time again I see the Labor Party stand up and say, we want transparency, we want transparency, we want transparency. And the government just keeps going off and doing what it does, which is to negotiate these things in secret. It turns out that when if we go back and have a look at just recently the Better Advice Bill, have a look at the Better Advice Bill. There was a bill that was in play there where the government presented to the parliament a bill that didn't have any of the regulations attached to it. And you know what? The Senate stood up. The Labor Party, the Greens, One Nation stood up and said, you know what? We're not going to let this bill pass until such time as we get to see all the data. And you know what? The government then pulled the bill. They saw the second reader, they worked out they didn't have the numbers, pulled the bill and have had to go away and then table the amendments. And that's what happens when the Senate stands up and says, you know what, we're not going to do things without proper analysis. Yet that's exactly what we're doing here. There is no analysis that suggests that this gives us an economic benefit. Interestingly, this bill involves China. Now, China has of recent times been acting in a manner that is quite harmful to Australia. We can see that the wine industry suffering. I hope Senator Farrell chips in and gives me a hear in relation to this. The wine industry is suffering as a result of changes that have occurred with China, acting outside of the trade agreement, and the problem that arises here is that we're effectively entering into further agreements with a country we know doesn't comply. So what happens is they don't comply, but we're the model party to these agreements. So for the next 2 or 3 years, Australian agriculture will suffer. Australian agriculture will suffer because we've got one party not playing the right part, or the right way, and then we've got Australia being modelled in the way it handles or conducts its international affairs. And that's the danger we have in further signing up to an agreement that may well benefit a country that is acting in a manner that is harmful to us. There's also the issue of human rights. Some of the countries involved in this are, in actual fact, in breach of human rights. The Labor Party stood up and affirmed its support to stop slave labour, to stop importing goods that come from slave labour. The Senate passed a bill in support of that, despite the government opposing it. And yet here we're entering into an arrangement that doesn't address that problem with some of the countries to whom are engaging in this slave labour. It's money before human rights, it would appear. Not that we even know that there's money involved in this for us. Typically, we've negotiated this sort of agreements and haven't done well. That's what typically happens. We're signing up an agreement with Myanmar, currently governed by a military junta that took power in an illegal coup in February this year. Seriously? That's what we're doing. We're engaging in commerce, engaging in negotiations with an illegitimate junta. So I don't understand some of these things. This agreement may well restrict local industry development by basically entrenching the rules that discourage government assistance to local industries. Now, already we have this perverse situation. I see this on the other side of the chamber all the time, where they talk about competitive advantage, which is an economic theory that says, well, if you can do it cheaper somewhere else, that's where you should do it. But what happens is the government imposes upon Australian companies. They come along to an Australian company and say, you know what, you've got to have leave loading, you've got to have long service leave, you've got to have minimum wages, you've got to have occupational health and safety, you've got to have environmental standards, you've got to build your product according to an Australian standard. Now, I don't object to any of those things, but we've got to recognise that imposes a cost. It imposes a cost on Australian business. We then look at the price and we say, well, hang on, it's cheaper to buy that from Vietnam or Burma or somewhere, where they don't have any of those rules. So I don't mind the theory of competitive advantage, provided it's applied in a practical manner, not in a completely theoretical manner. This bill entrenches some of those principles. Every time I stand up and say I'd like to see the government supporting Australian industry by way of procurement, I get confronted with, I'm sorry, Senator, that's going to breach trade agreements. Yet we sign up to these things. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense, particularly in circumstances where there is shown to be no economic benefit. Just downsides, just the downside risk. And we shouldn't be doing that. The Labor Party say that they support manufacturing, but they're now going to help sign up to an agreement that fetters the ability of the government to assist in rebuilding the very lows of manufacturing that we have. Now, I've talked on many occasions in the chamber about the need for us to stop exporting our rock, stop exporting iron ore, or stop just exporting our iron ore, stop just exporting our lithium. Instead, build steel and export steel. Build lithium-ion batteries and export batteries. Much greater value, generating intellectual property, generating jobs, generating value. Do that here. But every time we try and do that here, we get confronted with this competitive advantage. We say someone else can do it cheaper, but it's because we impose all of these costs upon Australian industry. And this treaty would seek to embed that even further. And that's why when it comes down to it, I can't support this. I'm all for free trade, or fair trade rather. I'm all for fair trade. But it's got to be, it has to be fair. And it's proven not to be fair in many, many circumstances. It does have the risk of increasing the number of temporary workers coming here to Australia that might be exploited. Something I thought the Labor Party cared about, workers being exploited. This can assist in that regard. It only takes the Labor Party to stand up once on a treaty and suddenly DFAT will have to change its conduct, just as the Treasury had to change its conduct in terms of presenting bills to this chamber without the regulations attached. Just takes, once or twice us standing up and saying no, and then DFAT will have to go back and negotiate these treaties in a different way, knowing the views of this chamber, knowing the views of the representatives of the Australian public. So there are other concerns I have in relation to this. This does not invoke ISDS, but that will be reviewed in a couple of years' time. Now, just so if people who don't understand what ISDS is, it's a schema whereby if the Australian government changes regulations, does something in the public interest that harms an international investor here in Australia, they can seek compensation for that. We saw that attempted in the case of cigarette tobacco advertising. We had a health measure to basically make sure we didn't make cigarette packets attractive. The cigarette manufacturer then takes us to the High Court, loses in the High Court, and then seeks to set up a company in Hong Kong to exploit the ability to then invoke ISDS, investor-state dispute settlement. So, and now in that particular instance, we're quite fortunate that the tribunal ruled that the company had been set up essentially for the purposes of engaging in ISDS, and so it was found that the tribunal didn't then agree. But we were up for potentially billions of dollars. This is a situation where the taxpayer underwrites the risk for a company. The taxpayer underwrites the risk for public companies. So companies can come here, they can make an investment, make an assumption that there will be no changes in the law, no changes in public policy, because if there are, we're going to invoke ISDS. And that's a risk that flows from this particular agreement, because there is a proposal to review this, again, likely to be done in secret and just presented as a fait accompli in a couple of years' time. And the Labor Party has a track record of it's part of its party platform is to not support ISDS, yet on several occasions they've wandered in here and voted for trade agreements that actually invoke ISDS. It's a bit of hypocrisy that is harmful to Australians, because again it sees the public underwriting the risk of companies. Now, I'll conclude by saying I support international trade. I recognise its benefits. But when something is presented to this parliament and it's in effect an agreement that does very little except expose us to risks, you have to stand back and say that's not in Australia's best interests. And that's what I will be saying when the bells ring. Thank you.